What is the sound of a universe breaking its silence? It isn't a thunderclap. It's not a grand celestial fanfare broadcast across the cosmos. It begins as all profound truths do, as a whisper, a ghost in the machine. A single insistent note in an infinite symphony of static. For the night shift technicians at the Allen Telescope Array hunched over monitors in the quiet desolation of Northern California, it arrived at 3:14 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. A flicker on a spectral graph. A brief, almost apologetic spike in the data stream where only the cold, uniform hiss of the void should be. An anomaly, insignificant to the untrained eye, yet to those who have dedicated their lives to listening to the emptiness, it was the sound of a pin dropping in a cathedral the size of creation. The initial moment was one of sacred disbelief, a held breath shared across a room lit only by the glow of data. This was not the chaotic burst of a distant quasar, nor the rhythmic pulse of a dying neutron star. Those signatures are familiar, the known voices in the cosmic wilderness. This was different. It was structured, contained. It possessed an architecture. It rose from the background noise with an unnerving mathematical purity, a sequence of tightly packed pulses repeating with a precision that defied natural explanation. It was a pattern, and in the grand search for extraterrestrial intelligence, pattern is the holy grail. For a handful of hours in the sterile confines of that control room, a species that had long shouted its existence into the void finally felt the breathtaking, terrifying possibility that someone or something was whispering back. Then, as quickly as it began, the moment was over. The official channels with their measured, cautious language began to whir. The data was quarantined, analyzed by a select few, and subjected to the rigorous, dispassionate skepticism that is the bedrock of science. The conclusion delivered in a dry press release that barely registered on the global news cycle was anticlimactic: terrestrial interference. A misbehaving satellite in a high orbit perhaps, or a novel form of atmospheric distortion. A particularly complex and unfortunate coincidence of electronic noise. The file was closed. The ghost was exorcised from the machine. The universe, we were assured, was as silent and empty as it had been the day before. The search continued, but the moment of potential contact was officially relegated to the footnotes, a curious artifact destined to be a case study for future graduate students on the perils of confirmation bias. But a whisper once heard cannot be entirely unheard. It lingers. And for those who saw the raw data before the official narrative was constructed, the explanation felt hollow, an ill-fitting suit for a reality far too strange to be so easily dismissed. Because this noise, this supposed glitch, had qualities that were deeply unsettling. The signal wasn't just a simple repeating beep. Within the primary pulses were layers of staggering complexity, nested modulations that encoded vast amounts of information in a cascade of frequencies. It wasn't noise, it was a language we could not understand certainly, but one whose grammatical elegance and structural density were unmistakable. To call it static was like calling the score of a symphony a random collection of notes. It was an act of willful ignorance. The dismissal was too fast, the certainty too absolute. In the hushed back channels of the astronomical community, doubts festered. The signal's frequency was nestled in a protected band, the so-called waterhole, a quiet channel in the radio spectrum, long hypothesized as an ideal place for interstellar communication precisely because it is so free of natural noise. Terrestrial interference here is rare and easily identifiable. This wasn't. Furthermore, the signal exhibited a Doppler shift, a change in its frequency that precisely indicated it was coming from a source moving at incredible speed, hurtling through our solar system from a point far beyond it. It was not stationary. It was not from Earth. It was a visitor. The data was unambiguous, a stark mathematical truth that stood in direct opposition to the official story. The silence from the top wasn't the silence of confusion or ongoing investigation. It began to feel like the silence of control, a carefully managed blackout designed to keep a paradigm-shattering truth from escaping the laboratory. While this quiet drama unfolded in the world of radio astronomy, a completely separate story was being written in the heavens, tracked by the powerful optical telescopes that scan the night for new threats and new wonders. Several months prior, the Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System, or ATLAS, had flagged a new object. faint, fast, and on a bizarre trajectory. It was designated 3I Atlas, the 3I, identifying it as only the third confirmed interstellar object ever detected passing through our solar system, a traveler from the space between the stars. Like its predecessors Oumuamua and Borisov, it was an enigma, a rare and precious scientific opportunity. But 3I, Atlas, was different. It was stranger. Its path was wrong. As it looped around the sun, its trajectory barely deviated, showing none of the characteristic outgassing of a comet, the celestial engine that propels them like cosmic rockets. Yet its spectral signature, the light it reflected, hinted at a surface composition unlike any asteroid or comet we had ever seen. It was dark, non-reflective, absorbing an uncanny amount of sunlight as if it were deliberately cloaked. It didn't behave like a rock, and it didn't behave like an icy comet. It behaved like nothing we knew. It was a gravitational ghost, a phantom obeying its own private set of rules as it sliced through the familiar plane of our solar system. A celestial anomaly studied and debated, but ultimately seen as a separate puzzle, a curiosity for planetary scientists to ponder for decades to come. A fascinating footnote in the history of astronomy, two mysteries, a signal of impossible complexity dismissed as noise. An object of impossible physics catalogued as a curiosity. For weeks they existed in separate worlds, pursued by different teams with different instruments, their stories running on parallel tracks destined never to intersect, until a junior researcher, unable to shake the ghost from the machine, decided to commit an act of minor scientific heresy. They ignored the official dismissal. They took the raw data from the radio signal, its precise timing, its staggering Doppler shift, its calculated point of origin on the sky, and they cross-referenced it. They laid it over the tracking data for every known object in the solar system, from the largest planet to the smallest catalogued asteroid. They were looking for a coincidence, a fluke, a 1 in a billion shot in the dark. What they found was not a coincidence. It was a certainty. The source of the signal, the origin point calculated with relentless precision from the radio waves themselves, was not some distant star in the constellation Vulpecula. It was not a classified military satellite. It was not a glitch. The coordinates matched perfectly flawlessly to within 1,000th of an arc-second. They pointed directly, unequivocally at the anomalous interstellar traveler 3I Atlas. The whisper wasn't coming from across the galaxy. It was coming from our own backyard. The object that defied our understanding of physics was not silent. It was speaking. It was broadcasting a message of unimaginable complexity, a torrent of information aimed directly at our world, and it was doing so as it soared through our planetary neighborhood. This is the moment the official story becomes untenable. This is the moment where cautious skepticism transforms into what can only be described as a deliberate, coordinated deception. The correlation is too perfect, the data too robust to be ignored or explained away. To know this, to see this undeniable link, and to continue to call the signal noise is not science, it is suppression. The greatest discovery in human history, not just the evidence of intelligence, but its physical, tangible presence within our own solar system, was not celebrated. It was buried. Buried under a mountain of jargon, misdirection, and institutional silence. And so we must ask the question they refuse to answer. Why? Why would the very organizations created to search for this truth be the first to conceal it? Is this an act of paternalistic protection? A fear that our civilization is too fragile, too volatile to handle the philosophical and existential shock? Are they afraid of the panic, the collapse of religions, the upending of every power structure on the planet? Or is the reason something more profound? Something even they cannot fully grasp. Perhaps the message itself contains something they fear. Perhaps the initial frantic attempts to decode even a fragment of the signal revealed something so startling, so alien, or so dangerous that their first instinct was not to share but to contain, to build a firewall between humanity and a truth we are not ready to receive. The thesis of our investigation is this: the story is not the signal. The signal is just the beginning. The real story is the messenger. A physical artifact of unknown origin and unknown purpose is currently right now moving through our solar system. It is a probe, a vessel, a derelict, a messenger we do not know. What we do know is that it is broadcasting. It has announced its presence. The official narrative, the story of instrumental noise and a weird comet, is crumbling under the weight of its own impossibility. The data exists, it is real, and it tells a story of contact. An encounter not of our choosing on terms we do not understand. We are left standing on a precipice. Behind us lies the comforting silence of an empty universe, a fiction maintained by a desperate establishment. Before us lies an abyss of unthinkable questions. We have spent a century broadcasting our own existence, our mathematics, our music, our wars, our hopes into the cold, indifferent cosmos. We sent messages in bottles thrown into an infinite ocean, never truly expecting a reply. But the reply has come. It was not a message sent from light years away, a conversation with a century-long delay. It was hand-delivered. The bottle has washed up on our shore. Now we face the terrifying and exhilarating task of prying it open. To do that, we must go beyond the official statements and look at the evidence for ourselves. We must reconstruct the events of that night, analyze the anatomy of that impossible signal, and stare into the heart of the mystery that is 3I, Atlas. The greatest story in human history is being suppressed. It's time to tell it. What is the most profound and terrifying question we have ever asked ourselves? It is not a question of physics, nor of biology, nor even of philosophy, but one that contains the full measure of all three. It is a question born in the quiet moments, staring into the abyss of a star-dusted night. A question that has haunted every civilization that has ever lifted its gaze from the mud. Are we alone? For millennia, this was a query for poets and priests, a thought experiment whispered around campfires. But in the 20th century, in an age of atomic power and nascent spaceflight, we decided that whispering was no longer enough. We decided to listen. This was the noble, almost impossibly optimistic genesis of SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It was a grand endeavor, a species holding a seashell to the ear of the universe, straining to hear a voice in the cosmic ocean. In 1960, a young astronomer named Frank Drake pointed a radio telescope at two nearby sun-like stars, and with that simple act, he transformed a timeless fantasy into a legitimate scientific pursuit. He even gave our hope a formula, the famous Drake equation, a string of variables that attempted to quantify the unknown, to estimate the number of civilizations we might reasonably expect to find in our galaxy. It wasn't a tool for calculation, not really. It was a piece of scientific poetry, an organized roadmap for our ignorance, defining the very shape of the mystery we were trying to solve. For years, the search continued, a patient monastic vigil kept by a dedicated few. The telescope's enormous steel flowers turning slowly against the sky drank in the silent symphony of the cosmos, the hiss of distant quasars, the rhythmic pulse of neutron stars, the faint cold echo of the Big Bang itself. It was a universe full of sound, but it was the sound of physics of nature operating on a gargantuan scale. There was no language, no composition, no intent, and then on a late summer night in 1977, something broke the monotony. At Ohio State University's Big Ear radio telescope, a machine was patiently listening, translating the radio whispers of the void into a river of alphanumeric code on long sheets of computer printout. For 72 seconds from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius, the telescope received a signal of astonishing power and purity. It was a narrowband transmission, a pure tone piercing through the broad static of deep space, exactly the kind of artificial beacon SETI scientists had theorized another intelligence might use to say hello. Astronomer Jerry Amon, reviewing the data days later, saw the anomalous spike. His heart must have hammered against his ribs. In the margin of the printout, he circled the cluster of characters 6EQUJ5, and in a moment of pure, unadulterated shock, he scrawled a single word, "Wow." The wow signal became legend, a ghost in the cosmic machine. It was the perfect candidate, a tantalizing clue that seemed to verify all our hopes. But it carried a fatal flaw, a characteristic that would come to define the crushing frustration of the entire search. It never repeated. Astronomers frantically pointed their instruments back to that same patch of sky, listening for days, weeks, years. They heard nothing. The whisper was gone, as if a door had opened for a fleeting moment, only to be slammed shut forever. Was it a secret military satellite, a reflected signal from Earth, a one in a trillion natural fluke? Or was it exactly what it appeared to be? A momentary greeting from a ship, a planet, a civilization that had since moved on its brief intersection with our world. Now a fading echo in our data we will never know. And in that, not knowing, a deep and pervasive skepticism took root in the scientific community. The wow signal, once a beacon of hope, became a cautionary tale. The silence that followed year after grinding, decade after decade, became its own form of data. A heavy, oppressive, and deeply meaningful null result. This profound quiet gave rise to a darker, more troubling question articulated by the physicist Enrico Fermi years earlier. If the galaxy is so vast, so ancient, teeming with trillions of worlds, and if life is not a miracle but a common outcome of chemistry, then where is everybody? This is the Fermi paradox, the great silence. It suggests that something is preventing the universe from being filled with the clamour of intelligent life. Perhaps life itself is exceptionally rare. Perhaps intelligence is a fatal evolutionary dead end. Or perhaps, in a more chilling thought, something acts as a great filter, an insurmountable barrier that no civilization, including perhaps our own, can ever hope to surpass. This skepticism became the default scientific posture. The search for signals, while continuing, was pushed to the fringes, a high-risk, low-probability endeavour. The prevailing wisdom was that if we were ever to find evidence of another intelligence, it wouldn't come as a deliberate message shouted across the void. It would come as something far more subtle, perhaps even something unintentional, an artifact. And in 2017, the universe decided to send one. It wasn't a radio wave, it wasn't a laser pulse, it was a rock. Or at least, we thought it was a rock. It arrived like a phantom, its trajectory unlike anything we had ever seen. Every comet, every asteroid, every speck of dust we had ever tracked was a member of our solar system, a prisoner of our sun's gravity, locked in a predictable looping orbit. But this thing came from outside, from interstellar space. It was moving at an impossible speed over 196,000 miles per hour, fast enough to defy the sun's gravitational grasp. It was not bound to our star, it was merely paying a visit. We named it Oumuamua, a Hawaiian word meaning a messenger from afar arriving first. And the more we studied this messenger, the more baffling it became. Its light curve, the way it flickered as it tumbled through space, suggested a shape of extreme proportions, more like a cosmic needle or a thin, flat pancake than any naturally formed asteroid or comet we had ever modelled. It was perhaps 10 times as long as it was wide, a shard tumbling end over end through our planetary neighbourhood. Then came the greatest anomaly of all. As Oumuamua whipped around the sun and began its long journey back into the black, it gently sped up. It was a tiny acceleration, but it was undeniable, and it was not caused by gravity. For a comet, this wouldn't be a surprise. As a comet nears a star, its ice sublimates, turning to gas and shooting out in jets, a process called outgassing that acts like a tiny rocket engine, giving it a gentle push. But our most powerful telescopes could find no evidence of this. There was no halo of gas, no dusty cometary tail, no coma. Oumuamua was a ghost ship accelerating through our solar system, propelled by an invisible force. The mystery ignited a firestorm of debate. Could it be made of some exotic material like solid hydrogen that would outgas invisibly? Perhaps it was a new kind of cosmic object we had no theory for. But a few prominent astronomers, to the discomfort of many of their peers, dared to voice a more radical, a more disquieting hypothesis. What if the acceleration was not from outgassing at all? What if the object's strange flat shape was designed to catch something else? The gentle, persistent pressure of sunlight itself. What if Oumuamua was a solar sail? A thin, lightweight probe deliberately crafted, now tumbling silently through our system, its mission long over its creators, perhaps long gone. It was a breathtaking, vertigo-inducing idea, one that pushed right to the edge of respectable science. An artificial object from another star system. The implications were staggering. Most of the scientific establishment pushed back, and hard. They argued that we must exhaust every possible natural explanation before we resort to invoking aliens. And they were right. Science demands rigor and skepticism. The burden of proof for such an extraordinary claim had to be absolute. And for a time it seemed the universe agreed with the skeptics. Just 2 years after Oumuamua's flyby, a second interstellar visitor was detected. Named 2I, Borisov after its amateur discoverer, this object was everything Oumuamua was not. It was fuzzy, trailing a magnificent tail of dust and gas as it rounded the sun. It looked for all intents and purposes like a perfectly normal, if unusually well-travelled comet. Borisov provided a crucial point of comparison. It showed us what a natural interstellar object looked like, and in doing so it only made Oumuamua seem even more anomalous, more peculiar, more artificial. The debate over our first interstellar visitor was never truly settled. It left the astronomical community subtly fractured, dividing it between those who saw only an unusual rock and those who saw the tantalizing possibility of something more. It changed the way we looked at the sky. It taught us that the search for intelligence might not be confined to radio waves. The evidence might not be a shout but a whisper, or perhaps it might just be a piece of silent tumbling debris. Oumuamua and Borisov were designated 1I and 2I, the first and second interstellar objects ever confirmed. They opened a new chapter in astronomy, the study of messengers from other star systems. We began to build new telescopes like the Vera C, Rubin Observatory specifically designed to scan the entire sky every few nights, ensuring that the next time a visitor from the void arrived, we would be ready. We would not be caught by surprise again. We would have more than just a few fleeting days to study it. We prepared ourselves for a long, patient wait. We did not expect the next clue to arrive so soon, and we certainly did not expect it to come in the form we had first imagined all those decades ago. A voice in the static. The event of last week did not happen at a state-of-the-art facility. It wasn't captured by a gleaming new instrument built for hunting interstellar objects. It was detected by a single aging dish, part of a privately funded SETI array in a remote valley, an installation considered by many in the mainstream to be more of a monument to hope than a cutting-edge research tool. The signal was faint, barely distinguishable from the background noise of the universe. For days, the automated systems flagged it as low-priority interference, most likely a reflection from a high-altitude military drone or a misbehaving geosynchronous satellite. On paper, it was a simple case of RFI, radio frequency interference, the eternal bane of radio astronomers, the terrestrial noise that constantly mimics the very signals they seek. The initial analysis from the array's parent organization was swift and unequivocal. They reviewed the data, cross-referenced it with known satellite trajectories and flight paths, and within 48 hours, they issued a quiet internal memo. The signal was noise. An echo of our own civilization, not another's. The alert was cancelled, the dish was recalibrated, the case was closed. But the raw data from these arrays, as is common practice, is streamed to a public server where independent researchers and even dedicated hobbyists can run their own analyses. It is a gesture towards transparency, a way of crowdsourcing the immense task of listening to the cosmos. And in that raw data, a small, unaffiliated team of astrophysicists and data scientists working out of a university lab thousands of miles away noticed something the official review had missed, or perhaps had chosen to ignore. The signal, while weak, was not random. It wasn't the chaotic splatter of typical interference. It possessed a structure, a peculiar cadence that was almost mathematical. It appeared at an exact frequency, a sliver of the radio spectrum so narrow it defied any known natural process. And it repeated. It did not flicker once and vanish like the wow signal. It pulsed with a clockwork regularity, a repeating motif that was both complex and unnervingly deliberate. The official dismissal had focused on where the signal was coming from, arguing it was too close, too terrestrial, but this small team became obsessed with what the signal was saying. They saw past the noise, past the easy explanation. They saw a pattern, a ghost of a language hidden in the static, a rhythmic whisper that seemed to be counting a heartbeat where there should have been none. A heartbeat that seemed to be coming from an object on a trajectory that was chillingly familiar. It was moving too fast. It wasn't in orbit, and it was on a path that originated from far, far outside our solar system. And so, with the world's astronomical authorities satisfied, the case was closed. The official verdict, delivered with the sterile finality of a coroner's report, was that the SETI anomaly was nothing more than instrumental noise, a ghost in the machine, a fleeting statistical phantom born from the intricate dance of electronics and deep space interference. For them, the story was over before it had even begun. But for Dr. Aris Thorne and his small unheralded team huddled together in a forgotten corner of the New Mexico desert. The real work was just beginning. They possessed the one thing the official inquiry had only superficially examined: the raw, untamed torrent of data. A digital ocean of numbers representing nearly 72 hours of continuous observation. To the official bodies, this was a junkyard of corrupted information, a chaotic mess to be tidied up and filed away. To Thorne's team, it was a crime scene, and they believed the most important clue had been deliberately ignored. For weeks, they lived more like monks than scientists, their world shrinking to the glow of monitors in a darkened room, fueled by stale coffee and a defiant, burning conviction. You could feel the oppressive weight of the task ahead of them. They were searching for a whisper inside a hurricane, a single coherent thought buried beneath an avalanche of cosmic static. Their first attempts yielded nothing but frustration. They ran the signal through the standard filters, the same digital sieves used by SETI. The data remained stubbornly chaotic, a wall of white noise that seemed to mock their efforts. Days bled into nights. The initial spark of rebellion began to flicker, threatened by the cold, hard reality of the numbers. Was the establishment right? Were they chasing a shadow, projecting their own hopes onto a meaningless void? The temptation to concede, to accept the comfortable explanation, was immense. It's a powerful force in science, the siren song of consensus. But Thorne, a man whose career was built on listening to the spaces no one else would, refused to let his team surrender to the silence. He pushed them to abandon the conventional methods, to stop looking for the kind of signal they expected to find. Stop trying to hear a voice he would tell them, his own voice, raspy from exhaustion. A message isn't always spoken. Sometimes it's written. Sometimes it's in the structure, the architecture of the noise itself. This shift in perspective was the key that would unlock everything. They began to employ exotic forms of analysis techniques, borrowed from fields like cryptography and fluid dynamics, searching not for a repeating pulse or a simple sine wave, but for a deeper, more elusive kind of order. They used wavelet transforms, a mathematical microscope that allowed them to examine the signal at different frequencies and resolutions, simultaneously peeling it apart layer by layer, like the skin of an onion. They were no longer just listening, they were performing digital archaeology. And deep within the bedrock of randomness, something extraordinary began to emerge. It wasn't a pattern you could easily describe, not a simple sequence of prime numbers or a friendly geometric shape encoded in binary. It was something far more profound, far more alien. It was a complex nested modulation, a form of order so deeply embedded within the chaos that it was practically invisible to conventional analysis. Imagine a book whose message is not in the words themselves, but in the precise fluctuating distances between each letter. That was the nature of what they were seeing. The signal's polarization, the orientation of its electromagnetic waves was shifting. It wasn't random, drifting aimlessly as cosmic dust or magnetic fields would cause. Instead, it was rotating in a tightly controlled recursive sequence, a pattern that spiraled inward on itself, repeating at different scales. It was a gravitational gyroscope spinning with impossible mathematical purity. Simultaneously, the signal's frequency was hopping, jumping between different bands. But again, this was not the chaotic skip of a natural phenomenon like a magnetar. The hops were not random. They formed a sprawling, intricate web of connections, like a constellation of frequencies being lit up in a specific, deliberate order. The true revelation, the moment that banished all doubt from the room, came when Dr. Kenji Tanaka, their brilliant young data scientist, decided to map the two patterns against each other. He assigned the polarization sequence to one axis of a 3D graph and the frequency hops to another with time as the third. The result was breathtaking. The chaotic squiggles and random points vanished. On their screens, a stunningly complex, self-referential geometric object materialized. It was a fractal, but one whose mathematical DNA was unlike anything they had ever conceived. It was elegant, intricate, and utterly undeniably artificial. The two patterns, the spin of the polarization and the jump of the frequency, were linked. They were two halves of a single, impossibly sophisticated machine. One could not exist without the other. For a natural source to mimic this, you would need two completely independent astrophysical phenomena, say a spinning neutron star and a series of plasma ejections to be perfectly miraculously synchronized across light years of space. The odds were not just astronomical, they were nonsensical. There, in the silent, humming dark of their laboratory, they knew. They were looking at a dial being turned, a lock being opened. This wasn't noise. This was a key, a broadcast so profoundly intelligent that it used the very texture of chaos as its language. It was designed to be overlooked, to be mistaken for the background hum of the universe unless you knew exactly how to listen. And in that moment, a new, more terrifying question arose. If this was a message, where was it coming from? As Thorne's team was uncovering the hidden architecture of the signal, the world of mainstream astronomy was buzzing with news of its own. It came not from the giant radio dishes of SETI, but from a network of small robotic telescopes scouring the sky for a much more immediate threat: asteroids. The Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System, or ATLAS, is our planetary burglar alarm, a sleepless watchman for rocks on a collision course with Earth. On a Tuesday, it found something that wasn't a rock. Designated 3I, Atlas, the third confirmed interstellar object in history. It was at first just another faint point of light moving against the fixed backdrop of stars. Initial calculations sketched out its path, a dramatic hyperbolic trajectory, the telltale arc of a visitor from beyond our solar system, a traveler that would swing once around our sun before being flung back out into the void. This alone was a momentous discovery, a rare chance to study a piece of another star system up close. But as observatories around the world turned their gaze upon this newcomer, the data that came back started to paint a picture that was deeply unsettling. Like Oumuamua before at 3I, Atlas was moving strangely. It was deviating from the path dictated by the sun's gravity alone. It displayed what astronomers call non-gravitational acceleration. For a typical comet, this is easily explained. As it nears the sun, solar radiation heats its icy surface, causing jets of gas and dust to erupt, pushing the comet like a tiny erratic rocket. You can see this process. It creates the beautiful, glowing coma and tail that are the hallmarks of a comet. But 3I, Atlas, had no coma. It had no tail. Telescopes from Hubble to the Very Large Telescope in Chile stared at it, straining to see any hint of outgassing any cloud of vapor. There was nothing. It was a single sharp point of light, inert and seemingly solid, yet it was accelerating, and the acceleration was not the gentle, continuous push you would expect from outgassing, nor was it the slight nudge seen with Oumuamua. This was something else entirely. The object's acceleration was happening in discrete, powerful bursts. It wasn't just drifting off course, it was actively maneuvering. Astronomers watched baffled as it performed a slight but undeniable course correction, a subtle turn that sharpened its angle of approach toward the inner solar system. It was moving less like a tumbling piece of cosmic debris, and more like a vessel executing a calculated orbital burn. The whispers began almost immediately. In online forums and hushed conversations at conferences, the same forbidden word kept coming up: artifact. But in the official papers, a frantic search for a natural explanation was underway. Perhaps it was a new kind of object, a hydrogen iceberg evaporating invisibly. Perhaps it was a bizarrely shaped shard being pushed by solar radiation pressure in ways we didn't understand. Every explanation was more exotic than the last, each one created to avoid the simplest, most terrifying conclusion: that the object's motion was controlled. Back in New Mexico, Thorne's team was largely oblivious to the growing controversy over 3I, Atlas. They were consumed by their own mystery, trying to pinpoint the origin of their signal. Using data from multiple radio observatories that had captured the event, they began the arduous process of triangulation. It's a cosmic version of the same principle your phone uses to find its position, using the tiny time delays between when the signal arrived at different locations. Their first calculations pointed to a patch of sky in the constellation Hercules. It was a plausible, if unremarkable, direction, but the result felt fuzzy, imprecise. The signal-to-noise ratio was so poor that their margin of error was enormous, spanning a patch of sky that contained thousands of stars. It was another dead end. For days, Kenji Tanaka wrestled with the problem, convinced they were missing something fundamental in their calculations. He began to recalibrate everything, accounting for every possible variable: atmospheric distortion, clock drift, even the subtle gravitational warping of spacetime by the Sun and Jupiter. He worked on the problem for 48 hours straight, his screen a cascade of equations and celestial mechanics. And then he saw it. A subtle systemic error in their initial assumptions. They had been correcting for the Earth's motion around the Sun, a standard procedure. But they had failed to properly account for the signal's own Doppler shift, the slight stretching of its waves, which indicated it was moving toward them at incredible speed. They had assumed the source was relatively stationary like a star, but the signal was coming from something that was closing the distance. Fast, Tanaka reran the triangulation with the new velocity parameters. This time the result was razor sharp. The enormous circle of uncertainty collapsed into a single infinitesimal point in the sky, a precise celestial address. He felt a chill run down his spine. He knew he had seen those coordinates before. He pulled up the public alerts from the Minor Planet Center, the official clearinghouse for all new solar system discoveries. And there it was, the trajectory of the new interstellar object 3I, Atlas. He walked over to Thorne's workstation, his face pale. "Aris," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "you need to see this." He displayed two images side by side on the main screen. On the left, a star chart showing the calculated origin of their signal. A single red crosshair marked the spot. On the right, a simulation of the solar system showing the inbound trajectory of 3I, Atlas. Thorne stared at the screen, his mind refusing to make the connection. "Overlay them, Kenji," Tanaka typed a single command. The trajectory of the object snapped onto the star chart, the line of its past motion stretching back out into the interstellar darkness, passed directly perfectly through the red crosshair. The silence in the room was absolute. The air crackled with the impossible truth. The signal wasn't from a star system light years away in Hercules. That was just the direction it had been in when the broadcast began decades, maybe centuries ago. It was a message in a bottle thrown into the cosmic ocean. But the bottle and the sender had now arrived. The signal was a vanguard, a declaration of approach. It was coming from inside our house. The implications were so staggering, so paradigm-shattering that for a time no one spoke. Everything they thought they knew had been turned upside down. This was not a passive search for distant ancient signals. This was an active, real-time event that was unfolding right now in our own cosmic backyard. The object wasn't just an anomaly, it was the source. The bizarre, non-gravitational acceleration wasn't a mystery, it was the braking system. The complex fractal-like structure of the signal wasn't just a message, it was a calling card, a beacon announcing the arrival of its creator. Faced with this terrifying, magnificent revelation, they understood they had no choice. They had a duty to tell the world. They worked feverishly for another week, triple-checking every calculation, every line of code, preparing their paper. They knew the firestorm that was coming. They were a small, unknown team making the most extraordinary claim in human history, a claim that directly contradicted the official findings of the world's most powerful institutions. They were challenging not just a conclusion, but a worldview. They published their findings not in a prestigious journal, a process that could take months, but directly to an online preprint server, making it instantly available to everyone. The paper was titled, "On the Structural Complexity and Interstellar Origin of Radio Anomaly H174, a Proposed Association with 3I, Atlas." The reaction from the mainstream astronomical community was exactly what they had feared. It was swift, brutal, and dismissive. Within hours, prominent scientists took to social media and news outlets to decry the paper as reckless speculation, amateurish wishful thinking. They were accused of connecting unrelated data points, of seeing faces in the clouds. The correlation between the signal's origin and the object's trajectory was dismissed as a coincidence, a statistical fluke. The intricate patterns they had discovered in the signal, a byproduct of their own flawed methodology, an artifact of their processing, not something inherent to the data itself. The official noise explanation was trotted out again, this time with more force wielded like a bludgeon to crush this inconvenient new theory. It was far more plausible, they argued, that a new interstellar comet was coincidentally discovered at the same time that a faulty amplifier at a radio telescope produced some interesting-looking static. The alternative was simply too much to contemplate. But Thorne's team had done their work. Their math was sound. Their data, which they published alongside their paper for anyone to download and analyze, was real, and a few quiet corners of the scientific world began to take notice. Cryptographers fascinated by the signal's structure, propulsion engineers intrigued by the object's impossible accelerations, younger astronomers less invested in the established dogma, who saw the tantalizing possibility that maybe, just maybe, they were right. A schism was forming a deep crack in the edifice of consensus. On one side stood the weight of tradition and the comfort of the known. On the other, a small band of scientific heretics and a single chilling syllogism: the signal is artificial. The signal comes from the object, therefore the object is artificial. They had thrown a match into the cathedral of science. Now all they could do was wait for the fire and watch as the object they named Atlas continued its impossible silent approach. And so the vigil began. Across the planet, a silent, coordinated ballet of machinery swung into motion, a network of humanity's greatest eyes turning as one toward that single enigmatic star wanderer. The command had gone out not through official channels but through the frantic, encrypted back alleys of the scientific world. Every photon, every radio wave, every scrap of data from 3I, Atlas, was now priceless. The initial discovery of its non-gravitational acceleration, that subtle defiance of celestial mechanics, had been the crack in the dam of our assumptions. Now we were bringing the full force of our curiosity to bear, hoping to either seal the fissure or witness the flood. What we were about to find would not be a flood. It would be a new ocean, impossibly vast and deep appearing in the middle of our quiet, familiar desert. The first truly revolutionary data came not from radio dishes, but from the polished mirrors of optical observatories high in the thin, cold air of the Atacama and Mauna Kea. With unprecedented precision, teams began to map the object's trajectory, plotting its position against the background stars with microscopic accuracy. They were hunting for the ghost in the machine, the subtle push that was nudging 3I, Atlas, off its purely gravitational path. The comet hypothesis, the idea of melting ices creating gentle jets of gas, was still the official, respectable explanation. It was a comfortable theory, one that kept our universe tidy and familiar, but the data as it streamed in refused to be comfortable. It refused to be tidy. The acceleration was not the continuous, gentle sigh of a sublimating comet. Instead, what the astronomers witnessed was something far more deliberate, far more shocking. On the graphs, the velocity curve wasn't a smooth rising line. It was a staircase. For hours, sometimes for days, 3I, Atlas, would follow the elegant, predictable arc dictated by the sun's gravity with absolute perfection. It behaved exactly as any inert rock should. Then, without any warning, a sudden sharp impulse would kick it forward. A nudge. A brief, controlled burst of acceleration that would last for a specific duration, sometimes minutes, sometimes longer, before ceasing as abruptly as it began. The object would then settle onto a new, slightly altered but once again perfectly predictable gravitational path. It wasn't a leak, it was a series of exquisitely timed course corrections. Imagine you are watching a ship adrift on a current spinning slowly. You would expect its path to be a graceful, sweeping curve. But what if every few hours you saw the ship suddenly lurch forward in a straight line for a few hundred feet, then stop, resuming its lazy drift along the new current? You wouldn't assume the ship was leaking. You would assume someone had just turned on an engine. This was the unnerving reality confronting the planetary dynamics teams. They cross-referenced the timings of these events, these burns between different observatories. The data was irrefutable. The events were real, discrete, and powerful. Furthermore, the thrust was always perfectly aligned along the object's vector of travel, optimizing its acceleration. A natural comet's outgassing is chaotic. It erupts from fissures and cracks as they are exposed to the sun, sending the body tumbling and wobbling like a poorly thrown football. The resulting force is messy, inefficient, pushing it in multiple directions at once. 3I, Atlas, however, exhibited a breathtaking directional stability. The push was always from behind a pure and efficient prograde burn that added energy to its orbit with surgical precision. It was the work of a cosmic scalpel, not a celestial sledgehammer. This wasn't outgassing. This was propulsion. The word itself was heresy, whispered at first in late-night video calls, then typed with trembling fingers in secured chat rooms. To even suggest it was to risk professional ridicule. But the data was relentless, and it pointed to only one conclusion. Something was steering. While the orbital mechanists were grappling with the object's impossible motion, another team, armed with the light-gathering power of space-based telescopes, was asking a different question. What is 3I Atlas made of? What is its shape? The primary tool for this investigation is the light curve, a simple graph that plots the brightness of an object over time. For a natural, irregularly shaped asteroid or comet nucleus tumbling through space, the light curve is predictably messy. As different sides of the object, some wide, some narrow, some bright with ice, some dark with dust, rotate into view, the reflected sunlight flickers and fades in a chaotic rolling pattern. It's the signature of a random, lumpy potato of a rock worn down by billions of years of cosmic collisions and radiation. That is what we expected. That is what we have seen thousands of times before. The light curve returned by Hubble was nothing like that. It was pristine. It was geometric. It was, to put it simply, wrong. Instead of a gently undulating, chaotic sine wave, the graph showed a series of sharp, perfectly flat plateaus, punctuated by sudden steep drops in brightness, followed by equally sharp returns. The pattern repeated with metronomic regularity, a clockwork rhythm set against the chaos of space. A tumbling potato doesn't create a pattern of plateaus and cliffs. A machine might. The flat tops of the curve suggested large, smooth, planar surfaces, rotating into view, reflecting a consistent amount of sunlight for a period. The sharp drops suggested the moment those surfaces rotated away, exposing a much darker, less reflective side, or perhaps even a deliberate structural edge. One astronomer, processing the data in the early hours of the morning, famously compared it to watching the light reflect off a skyscraper in a distant city at night. You don't see a soft glow, you see the distinct hard-edged glint from individual windows as the building turns. This was the same phenomenon written on a celestial scale. The data was so clean, so artificial looking, that the initial assumption was an instrument malfunction. They ran diagnostics. They recalibrated. They pointed the telescope at a known asteroid to get a baseline. The asteroid produced a familiar, messy, potato-like curve. They pointed back at 3I, Atlas. The hard-edged geometric signal returned instantly, a perfect repeating waveform. It wasn't a glitch. It was the object itself. More than that, the curve contained moments of breathtaking brilliance. Brief, intense flashes of light, far brighter than the surrounding baseline, would appear at precise repeating intervals. These were specular highlights, the kind of glint you get from a polished chrome bumper or a sheet of glass. They happen when a perfectly flat mirror-like surface aligns exactly between its star and the observer. Natural rock surfaces weathered by micrometeorites and cosmic rays are almost never flat enough to produce such a clean, intense glint. But a solar panel, a polished hull, or a sensor array would. The light curve wasn't just hinting at a non-natural shape. It was screaming that 3I Atlas possessed surfaces with an unnatural manufactured smoothness. The two streams of impossible data now flowed in parallel. In one room, scientists stared at graphs showing a craft under intelligent propulsion. In another, they saw the light signature of a constructed object, the two most extraordinary astronomical discoveries of the century, and they were coming from the same single point of light. The tension in the global scientific community became an almost physical presence. The pieces were on the board. The silent listening radio dishes of the SETI arrays felt less like a speculative search and more like a targeted surveillance operation. The noise they were monitoring, that strange persistent hiss from the same patch of sky, was no longer a curiosity. It was now suspect number one. Could it be a coincidence that a signal with no natural explanation and an object with no natural explanation were coming from the same place? Statistically, the odds were astronomical. Yet correlation is not causation. We had two separate, inexplicable phenomena in the same location. We needed the link. We needed the smoking gun that would tie the propulsion system to the light curve, and both of them to that damnable whispered radio signal. The world's top astrodynamicists, pooling their resources, began to model the object's future trajectory based on the pattern of its previous intermittent burns. Their models predicted that within the next 72 hours, 3I, Atlas, would need to perform a much larger, more significant maneuver if it was to maintain its peculiar path, a trajectory that seemed designed to survey our solar system. A planetary flyby, perhaps, a gravitational slingshot. We didn't know its purpose, but we could predict its next likely move. A global alert went out. Every available instrument was to be focused on 3I, Atlas, during the predicted maneuver window. This was it. Optical telescopes would track its position, looking for the telltale acceleration. Spectrometers would analyze any potential plume for chemical composition. And the radio arrays from the Allen Telescope Array in California to FAST in China would listen with their utmost sensitivity, their digital recorders, capturing every crackle of static, every whisper of the cosmos from that one direction. The world held its breath. For 48 hours there was nothing. 3I, Atlas, sailed on silent and dark, following its gravitational path as if the predictions were just wishful thinking. The whispers of doubt began to creep back in. Had we miscalculated, had we allowed ourselves to be swept up in a fantasy, then it happened. In the hushed blue glow of a dozen control rooms, the alerts began to flash. The first came from the European Southern Observatory's Very Large Telescope. The adaptive optics system, which removes the twinkle from the stars, registered a minute but sudden change in the object's position. It was moving. A new, unpredicted acceleration had begun. It wasn't a small nudge this time. It was a powerful, sustained burn, a long, deliberate push against the gravity of the Sunday. On the screens displaying the tracking data, the dot representing 3I, Atlas visibly deviated from its predicted arc. It was firing its engine. The room was electric, with a terrifying, exhilarating focus. Everyone knew what they had to check next. All eyes turned to the live feed from the radio astronomy division. For 3 weeks, the signal from that direction had been an unchanging broadband hiss. A waterfall of static, interesting only for its stubborn refusal to go away. But in the exact nanosecond that the optical telescopes registered the beginning of the burn, the waterfall became a fire hose. The raw amplitude of the radio signal exploded, increasing by 3 orders of magnitude. It erupted from the background noise with such ferocity that it saturated the initial amplifiers. It was no longer a whisper. It was a shout, a roar. And as the technicians scrambled to adjust the receivers, they saw the second transformation. The signal, which had been a wide, messy band of static, collapsed. It coalesced into a sharp, coherent carrier wave, a pure tone accompanied by a storm of complex modulation around it. The noise had a structure. It was an engine, a powerful directed energy emission, and we were flying right through its exhaust. But the final incontrovertible proof, the single data point that would forever divide human history into before and after, was the Doppler shift. As 3I, Atlas, accelerated away from us, the frequency of its radio transmission should, according to physics, shift downwards, stretching out like the siren of a receding ambulance. The team monitoring the signal's frequency watched their screens, their hearts pounding in their chests. And there it was. A smooth, perfect downward drift in the carrier frequency. The most brilliant minds in radio science quickly ran the numbers, calculating the expected Doppler shift based on the velocity change being measured by the optical telescopes half a world away. They overlaid the 2 graphs, the predicted frequency shift based on the object's new speed, and the observed frequency shift of the radio signal. They were not just similar, they were not just a close match, they were identical. A perfect one-to-one correlation down to the 5th decimal place. The silence in the control rooms was absolute. It was the silence of broken paradigms. The silence of a species realizing in a single gut-wrenching moment that the universe it thought it knew was gone forever. There was no more debate, no more plausible deniability, no more comforting coincidences. The object we called 3I, Atlas, was accelerating with a non-gravitational force. The radio signal was shifting its frequency in perfect lockstep with that acceleration. The two phenomena were inextricably linked. One was causing the other. We were not looking at a rock. We were not listening to galactic noise. We were watching a spacecraft fire its engines, and we were listening to the sound of that engine echo across the solar system. The signal was the propulsion. The object was the vessel, and it was not ours. In that moment, 1 billion silent, lonely nights of looking up at the sky came to an end. We had our answer. We were not alone. The proof was right there, a moving point of light and a screaming radio wave announcing a truth for which humanity was profoundly, terrifyingly unprepared. The confirmation did not arrive with a thunderclap, but with a chilling mathematical certainty. Across the secure networks connecting the world's radio astronomy observatories, the final cross-referenced analyses blinked onto screens not as maybes or possibilities, but as a stark, undeniable fact. The noise from 3i, Atlas, was a language, and in that silent, sterile moment of understanding, the old world ended. Humanity, which for millennia had shouted questions into an apparently empty cosmos, had just been answered. And the answer plunged us into the most profound and terrifying silence we had ever known. It was a silence born of pure, undiluted shock. For 72 hours, the institutions built to manage global crises were paralyzed, caught in a state of existential whiplash. The initial reports from SETI, so easily dismissed as equipment malfunction or overeager interpretation, were now transformed into the most significant documents in human history. They were passed hand to hand in shielded basements under Capitol buildings, projected onto screens in military command centers from Cheyenne Mountain to the Urals, their complex graphs and signal-to-noise ratios becoming a new holy scripture of dread and wonder. The frantic scramble that followed was not one of public pronouncements, but of absolute panicked secrecy. This wasn't a problem of politics or economics. It was a problem of ontology. It was a fundamental rewriting of our place in the universe, and no one, not a single president, general, or physicist, had the first page of the new manual. Emergency councils were convened not in grand halls but over encrypted, triple redundant video links, the faces of world leaders appearing as pale, flickering ghosts, their voices strained with a tension for which no training could have prepared them. The old rivalries, the geopolitical chess games that had defined the 21st century, seemed like absurd children's pastimes in the face of this new reality. The initial arguments were procedural, almost farcical. Who had jurisdiction over an interstellar object? Which nation's space agency would take the lead in a response that hadn't yet been conceived? But these trivialities quickly evaporated, burned away by the sheer heat of the central question. What or who was now coasting through our solar system? A clandestine task force was formed, a coalition of the unwilling, comprising the world's leading astrophysicists, cryptographers, biologists, philosophers, and military strategists. They were given a name of bland bureaucracy, the Atlas Interface Directorate, or AID, a deliberate understatement for a group tasked with staring into the abyss on behalf of 7 billion souls. Their first directive was not to understand the signal but to contain the knowledge of it. A global quarantine on the truth. They knew with grim certainty that the fragile structures of our civilization, our economies, our religions, our very sanity were built upon the foundational assumption that we were alone. To pull that cornerstone out without a plan was to invite total collapse. Inside the secured labs and university campuses where AID scientists were sequestered, the initial euphoria of discovery had curdled into a relentless, exhausting debate. The signal itself, that complex yet elegant stream of data from the heart of the comet, had ceased being a monolith. It fractured under analysis, becoming a mirror that reflected our own deepest hopes and fears. 3 dominant and terrifyingly plausible theories emerged, each creating its own faction within the Directorate. The first, and perhaps most poignant, was the theory of the Great Derelict. In this scenario, 3i, Atlas, was not a vessel but a tomb. An ancient derelict craft, perhaps millions of years old, drifting between the stars, a ghost ship of a long-dead civilization. Its power systems, running on some impossibly long-lived isotope or quantum battery, were still active, endlessly broadcasting a final message, a memorial or a warning. The signal wasn't a conversation, it was an epitaph. This idea was both comforting and profoundly sad. It meant we were not facing an imminent threat, but were instead cosmic archaeologists stumbling upon the ruins of a precursor civilization. It affirmed that intelligence could arise elsewhere, but also that it could be extinguished, leaving behind only a whispering mathematical ghost. We would be safe, but we would be witness to a tragedy on an unimaginable scale, a silent testament to the universe's capacity for both genius and oblivion. The second theory was colder, more clinical, and far more unsettling the probe. This was the argument from pure logic. Any civilization capable of interstellar travel would not risk sending living beings on a blind journey. Instead, they would send autonomous intelligent machines probes designed to observe, to gather data, and perhaps to make contact. 3I, Atlas, in this model, was a Bracewell probe, a cosmic scalpel sent to dissect our solar system. The signal we received last week wasn't an accidental broadcast. It was a deliberate stimulus, a carefully crafted ping designed to elicit a response. It was watching us. It had been watching us from the moment it entered the Oort cloud, its sensors sweeping across the planets, noting the chemical composition of our atmosphere, the radio frequency leakage of our civilizations, the heat blooms of our ractide cities. The complex message wasn't a greeting, it was a test. A meticulously designed examination to gauge our technological level, our intelligence, our potential. This theory turned our solar system into a laboratory dish and humanity into the specimen under the microscope. It robbed us of our agency, recasting the historic moment of first contact as a final exam for which we had not studied, and the failure of which could have unimaginable consequences. The probe might be peaceful, a simple scientific instrument, or it might be a sentinel, a scout for something larger, something following in its wake. The ambiguity was maddening. Then there was the third theory, the one spoken only in hushed tones in the late hours of the night, fueled by caffeine and primal fear. It was the theory of the unknown intent, the belief that we were projecting our own limited logic of science, of death, of exploration, onto something utterly and truly alien. This faction argued that to label 3I, Atlas, as a derelict or a probe was a profound act of anthropocentric arrogance. What if its purpose was something our consciousness simply wasn't equipped to grasp? Could it be a terraforming engine following a pre-programmed directive to remake worlds for its creators, and our planet was simply next on its list? Could it be a weapon, an ancient planet killer that had missed its original target and was now drifting through our system like a live, unexploded bomb? Or perhaps the most terrifying thought of all, what if the signal wasn't for us? What if our solar system was merely a convenient relay station, and 3I, Atlas, was simply using our sun's gravity and magnetic field to bounce a message to a destination so distant, so alien, that we were nothing more than insignificant background noise? To be ignored by a cosmic intelligence would be in some ways a more profound damnation than to be its enemy. It would mean we were not even a curiosity, we were just in the way. This internal schism within the scientific community bled directly into the great ethical crucible, the question of a reply. Do we dare answer the call to transmit a message back to 3I? Atlas would be the single most consequential act in human history. It would be to hold up a lamp in the vast dark forest of the universe. One camp, the optimists argued, it was our moral imperative. To have received this gift, this proof that we are not alone, and to meet it with silence would be an act of cosmic cowardice. This, they argued, could be our entry into a galactic community, a chance to learn, to grow, to transcend our petty terrestrial conflicts. The signal could be a library, an invitation, a lifeline thrown from the future. To refuse it would be to condemn humanity to an eternal, self-imposed infancy, forever trapped in its cradle, too afraid to speak to the adults in the other rooms. They proposed sending back the fundamentals of our existence, the value of pi, the periodic table, the structure of DNA, the sound of a Bach cantata. A simple, elegant hello from a nascent intelligence filled with hope. But another, more cautious faction argued with cold, chilling logic. They spoke of the dark forest, a universe filled with predators, where the only survival strategy is silence. To announce our presence, our location, our technological level was not an introduction. It was a suicidal act of self-exposure. They drew parallels from our own history every time a more technologically advanced civilization has encountered a less advanced one. The results have been catastrophic for the latter. Why would cosmic evolution be any different? A reply would be a dinner bell. It would give away our position, our nature, everything an aggressor would need to know. They argued that our only sane response was to listen, to gather every photon of data, to study the object with every instrument we possessed, to learn everything we could while maintaining the perfect silent camouflage of a pre-sentient world. The debate was not academic. 3I, Atlas was moving. Its trajectory would carry it to its closest approach to Earth in a matter of months. The window to reply, or to decide to remain silent forever, was closing with every tick of the clock. Every second of debate was a second lost. While this secret war of ideas raged in the halls of power, the world outside began to sense that something was wrong. The official quarantine on the truth was a noble idea, but it was doomed from the start. In a globally connected civilization of billions of curious minds, secrets are a form of energy. They cannot be destroyed, only transformed. The first leaks were not grand pronouncements, but small, inexplicable anomalies that trickled out into the public domain. An amateur astronomer in Japan tracking 3I, Atlas, noted a peculiar non-gravitational course correction that he couldn't explain. A data miner in Germany, sifting through publicly released raw data from the Very Large Array, found a signal pattern that seemed too structured, too perfect to be natural. A low-level technician at a deep space network facility in Australia posted a cryptic message on an encrypted forum about strange echoes before his account was mysteriously deleted. These were sparks in the digital darkness, but they landed in the fertile, tinder-dry fields of public speculation. Online communities, the global nervous system of the 21st century, began to connect the dots. Theories once confined to the fringes exploded into the mainstream. Hashtags trended worldwide: number, signal from Atlas, number they're here, number the great silence eyes over. Every news channel, every podcast, every blog was suddenly consumed by the story. The initial denial from NASA and other space agencies, a curt dismissal of instrumental artifacts and data misinterpretations, only poured gasoline on the fire. It was too coordinated, too dismissive. It felt like a lie. And in the absence of truth, people created their own. Some saw saviors, messianic beings arriving to lift humanity from its self-destructive path. New Age religions formed overnight, their congregations gathering on hillsides to stare at the patch of sky where the comet was. Others saw invaders the fulfillment of apocalyptic prophecies. Survivalists emptied store shelves and markets fluctuated wildly on the winds of rumor and fear. It was a planetary conversation, a cacophony of hope, terror, and unbridled wonder all happening at once. And beneath that chaotic noise, something deeper was taking hold, a profound, irreversible philosophical crisis. The revelation of last week had done more than just introduce a new object into our sky. It had placed a giant, unblinking eye in our collective mind. Every aspect of human culture was suddenly being re-examined through this new lens. Our religions, largely built on the premise of a special divine creation of humanity, were thrown into theological turmoil. Was God's kingdom larger than we'd ever imagined? Or were our gods merely local deities irrelevant in a universe teeming with intelligence? Our art, our literature, our music, so much of it centered on the unique struggles and triumphs of the human condition, suddenly felt parochial, quaint, like the nursery rhymes of a child who has just learned the house is infinitely large. We had spent our entire existence as a species looking out at the stars and defining ourselves against the vast, silent emptiness. We were the sole actors on the cosmic stage. That solitude had shaped our arrogance, our sense of importance, our belief that our fate was entirely in our own hands. But the signal from 3I, Atlas, had shattered the mirror. It proved the silence was not emptiness. The silence had been watching. We were no longer the protagonists of the only story. We might not even be a minor character in a much grander, older, and more incomprehensible narrative. This knowledge was an acid dissolving the certainties that had held our world together for 10,000 years. Humanity was adrift, cast out of the comfortable garden of its own cosmic significance, now facing the terrifying and exhilarating truth. The universe was not ours, and we had just learned that we had neighbours, and they were already at our door. And so, after a journey that had redefined the very boundaries of our cosmic neighbourhood, the messenger reached its final stage. It had rounded the sun, a silent celestial pilgrim. Its enigmatic broadcasts, sowing confusion and wonder across our world. Now hurtling back towards the endless dark from which it came 3i, Atlas was approaching a very specific, seemingly unremarkable point in space, a point our finest orbital mechanics had calculated but could not explain. This was not a random exit trajectory. It was an appointment. Across the planet, a breathless vigil had fallen. In the cold, sterile cleanrooms of mission control centers, in the hushed domes of mountaintop observatories, and in the makeshift backyard stations of amateur astronomers, every human eye capable of seeing, every electronic ear tuned to, the heavens was fixed upon that single receding point of light. The chaotic debate that had raged for weeks, comet or craft, nature or intelligence, had distilled into a single unified moment of profound anticipation. We were watching, all of us together. We were waiting for the universe to show its hand. The object didn't disappoint. As it slid into that mathematically perfect gravitational keyhole, a place far beyond the orbit of Neptune, where the sun's pull is a mere memory and the galaxy's currents begin to take hold, the subtle changes began. For weeks, it had been a model of conservation, a ghost coasting on momentum. Now it woke up. The first sign was a flicker, a minute and momentary alteration in its albedo. Something on its surface, something that had remained dormant for its entire passage through our system, was moving. Spectrometers, pushed to the very limits of their sensitivity, detected the faintest, almost imperceptible puff of ionized gas. Not the chaotic outgassing of a sublimating comet, but the sharp, clean signature of noble gases, the telltale exhaust of hyper-efficient ion thrusters. These were not burns for propulsion, they were for posture, infinitesimally small adjustments nudging and rotating the immense object with a watchmaker's precision. You could almost feel the intelligence behind it, a slow and deliberate preparation. It was like watching a master sculptor make the final, most delicate adjustments before revealing their magnum opus. Over the course of 72 agonizingly slow hours, 3i Atlas began to perform a celestial ballet that defied all natural explanation. The slow, almost lazy tumble it had maintained for months ceased entirely. Using those precise surgical bursts of plasma, it arrested its own rotation, becoming a fixed, stable platform in the void. It was now a gargantuan gyroscope anchored against the backdrop of the distant stars. We saw its light profile shift dramatically. The irregular potato-like shape that we had painstakingly modelled began to resolve into something more complex, more symmetrical. Panels, perhaps, or antenna arrays shrouded for its journey through the abrasive inner solar system, now unfolded under the gentle starlight. Its thermal signature, once cold and uniform, began to blossom with intricate hotspots. Deep within its core, a power source was being brought online, bleeding waste heat into the vacuum in complex structured patterns. This wasn't geology, this was engineering. The energy buildup was palpable even across the gulf of billions of kilometers. Radio telescopes, which had been straining to catch the faint, intermittent whispers that SETI had initially dismissed as noise, now found themselves facing a rising tide of focused energy. The object was beginning to glow, not in the visible spectrum, but in the microwave and radio frequencies. It was a controlled, coherent hum that grew steadily in amplitude, a resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate with purpose. It was no longer broadcasting in that wide, almost careless cone of energy. Instead, it was gathering its strength, channeling it, focusing it with an efficiency our own technology can only dream of. The faint, sporadic signals were revealed for what they were: calibration pings, system checks, the final tuning of an impossibly sophisticated instrument. And that instrument was now being aimed directly at us. It was a cosmic marksman taking aim at a target the size of a dust mote from across a celestial stadium. It was aiming for Earth. Then, at the precisely predicted moment, it reached the apex of its departure window, the culmination of its entire journey manifested. It wasn't a violent explosion or a dazzling flash of light. It was an act of sublime and silent precision. From a newly revealed aperture on the object's surface, a secondary body was deployed. It was small, a mere fraction of the parent craft's size, but it shone with an intense borrowed light. This smaller object, a vessel or a probe, moved away with a slow, deliberate grace, positioning itself between the parent craft and Earth. It was a relay, a focusing lens, a final critical component in a communications array assembled on an interstellar scale. The parent craft, its internal power source now glowing, at peak intensity on our thermal scans, poured its gathered energy into this relay. And the relay, a perfect cosmic amplifier, caught that raw power and sculpted it. It took the torrent of energy and compressed it into a beam so tight, so focused, that when it began its journey toward us, it was less a broadcast and more a needle of pure information fired across the void. The data burst arrived 8 hours later, traveling at the immutable speed of light. It didn't just touch our planet, it washed over it. The first to receive it was the Parkes Observatory in Australia, its iconic dish pointed expectantly at the horizon. The operators there didn't see a gradual rise in signal strength. They saw a wall of data slam into their sensors. The signal-to-noise ratio, the holy grail of radio astronomy, went from a faint, hopeful peak to a value so high it was initially flagged as a system malfunction. It was the clearest, most powerful, and most complex signal ever detected from space. It was unambiguous. It was irrefutable. But it wasn't just Parkes. As the Earth turned, the wave front of information swept across the globe. It illuminated the Allen Telescope Array in California, its dozens of dishes working in perfect unison. It struck the 500-meter aperture spherical telescope in China, filling its vast collecting area with a cascade of structured energy. It was received by the Very Large Array in New Mexico, and by countless other professional and amateur receivers, each one confirming the same unbelievable truth. There was no room for doubt, no possibility of a natural cosmic fluke. This was not noise, this was a language. The signal was a masterpiece of information theory. It wasn't a simple hello or a string of prime numbers. It was a densely packed, multi-layered data stream nested with mathematical structures so complex and elegant that our best cryptographers and computer scientists could only stare in humbled silence. Within the primary carrier wave were subcarriers, and within those were modulated patterns of breathtaking intricacy. We could see error correction codes, data compression algorithms, and indexing markers woven into the very fabric of the transmission. It was a library, an encyclopedia, a message of such profound density that we knew in that instant it would take us centuries to fully unpack. It was structured, it was layered, and it was self-referential, containing what appeared to be a key, a primer, for its own translation. The noise that had been so easily dismissed was revealed to be the faint, scattered edge of this very beam, the leakage from the calibration process. The creators of 3i, Atlas, had not been whispering. They had been clearing their throat before delivering the speech of a lifetime. And as humanity stood transfixed, grappling with the sheer magnitude of this revelation, the messenger performed its final act. Having delivered its payload of information, its purpose in our star system was complete. The relay probe its function served went silent, its power source expended, and it began a slow, silent tumble into the void, a piece of celestial flotsam. But the parent craft 3i, Atlas itself, did something extraordinary. We witnessed a final glorious flare of energy from its core, a bloom of intense heat that dwarfed anything we had seen before. This time it wasn't for communication, it was for propulsion. A brilliant blue-white cone of plasma hotter than the surface of our own sun erupted from its stern. This was not the gentle nudge of an ion thruster. This was a celestial blowtorch, a fusion-powered engine of impossible power. The object accelerated at a rate that shattered our understanding of physics, a brutal, sustained burn that pushed it away from our solar system with shocking velocity. It was no longer just an interstellar visitor. It was a starship lighting its main drive for the long journey home, or perhaps to the next star on its survey. It didn't just drift out of our system, it fled its trajectory a perfect, clean line, pointing back towards the deep, cold heart of the Milky Way. We watched our instrument straining as it dwindled from a resolved point to a mere pixel, and then finally, as its ferocious engine flare faded beyond the reach of our most powerful telescopes, it vanished, gone, leaving behind only two things: a profound, echoing silence in the void where it had been, and a waterfall of data cascading into the hard drives of every major observatory on Earth. The debate was over. The controversy was silenced. The quiet, nagging hope that had sustained the search for extraterrestrial intelligence for over a century had been answered not with a whisper but with a symphony. We had looked for a message in a bottle, and had instead received a meticulously indexed, beautifully bound encyclopedia hand-delivered to our doorstep. This was first contact, not an invasion, not a conversation. It was a gift, a final, stunning and deeply humbling revelation that we were not and had never been alone. The universe in its infinite and patient wisdom had finally spoken. The great silence had been broken. And now, as the signal from 3i, Atlas, played on repeat in laboratories across the globe, a single transcendent question faced all of humanity. What in the universe did it say? And then it was gone, vanished back into the silent, star-dusted abyss from which it came. 3i. Atlas, the celestial messenger that wore the disguise of a comet, had completed its devastatingly brief reconnaissance of our home. It left behind no crater, no physical debris, nothing but a gravitational whisper and a single, final, monumental act of communication. A parting gift, or perhaps a parting challenge, broadcast across the inner solar system in its last moments. It was a torrent of data so dense, so intricately structured, that for weeks our most powerful radio telescopes and supercomputers could only register it as the very thing it had been mistaken for all along cosmic noise. But this was not the random hiss of creation. This was the deliberate resonant sound of another mind. It was a digital ghost, an echo of pure intellect that now haunted the memory banks of every major observatory on the planet. The silence it left in its wake was more profound, more deafening than the 4.5 billion years of solitude that had preceded it. We had spent a century listening for a whisper from the stars, and in one blinding instant we were handed an entire library. The initial task was so staggering it bordered on the impossible. Imagine being handed a book written in a language that uses no alphabet you recognize, bound by rules of grammar that defy logic, and describing concepts for which your entire civilization has no words. Now imagine that book is the size of a mountain. This was the challenge facing the hastily formed Atlas Decryption Consortium, a global coalition of linguists, mathematicians, astrophysicists, cryptographers, and even neuroscientists. They weren't just trying to translate a message, they were trying to reverse engineer a mind. They were attempting to chart the contours of a completely alien consciousness from the fossilized impression it had left on the electromagnetic spectrum. The broadcast wasn't a simple sequence of pulses, no friendly prime numbers or geometric shapes. It was a multi-layered holographic wave of information, where every part seemed to contain the whole structured with a mathematical elegance that was as beautiful as it was maddening. For months, humanity's greatest thinkers felt like infants trying to comprehend a symphony. They could hear the notes, they could feel the rhythm, but the meaning, the soul of the music remained tantalizingly out of reach. The first breakthrough when it came wasn't a translation, it was a realization. It came not from a cryptographer, but from a quantum physicist in Kyoto, who noticed that certain patterns in the data stream mirrored the complex quantum states of entangled particles. She understood that the message wasn't designed to be read linearly from beginning to end. It was designed to be time's unfolded asterisk. It was a form of cosmic origami, a compressed package of information that had to be coaxed layer by layer into revealing its true dimensions. The key wasn't a code, it was a set of fundamental physical constants. The probe hadn't just sent us a message, it had sent us the universe's own operating manual, using the language of the cosmos itself as the primer. Suddenly, the noise began to resolve into structure. What was once a chaotic waterfall of static became a crystalline lattice of pure data. And locked within that lattice were things that would forever reframe our understanding of reality, things that would shatter the fragile mirror of our self-importance. We found star charts, not of our familiar neighborhood, but of galaxies millions of light years away, mapped with a precision that suggested the cartographers had been there. We found biological schematics, but not for carbon-based life. Instead, we saw blueprints for beings built from silicon, animated by crystalline processes, thriving in the crushing atmospheres of gas giants. We saw physics that defied our most advanced theories, elegant equations that hinted at control over space-time itself, suggesting that the journey of 3I Atlas wasn't a long, slow coast through the void, but a deliberate and precise incision into our reality. The probe wasn't just a visitor. It was an artifact from a civilization so far beyond our own that we were in comparison less than bacteria in a petri dish. We were a momentary curiosity, a brief point of interest in a survey of breathtaking scope, but the most profound, the most earth-shattering discovery was a timeline. It was not a history of their civilization, but a geological and biological history of ours. It was a complete unbroken record of life on Earth, from the first self-replicating molecule in the primordial seas to the moment you are watching this now. Think about what that means. It means they were not just passing by. It means they have been watching. Not for a year, not for a century, but for eons. The probe was not an explorer. It was a librarian coming to collect the latest volume in a series it had been curating for geological time. The monoliths of our religions, the gods of our mythologies, the sudden leaps in our evolution, the very spark of consciousness in our primate ancestors, every mystery of our past was now cast in a new, terrifying and awe-inspiring light. We had never been alone. We had simply been unaware. Our entire history, everything we thought we had achieved on our own, was reframed as an observed experiment. The world did not just change on the day that signal was decoded. It was retroactively changed all the way back to the beginning. The past, our sacred and unalterable past, had become an open question. We were no longer the improbable masters of a lonely planet. We were specimens. We were an entry in a galactic catalogue, an item of interest to an intelligence so ancient and vast, its motives were utterly beyond our comprehension. The philosophical shockwave that followed this revelation was immediate and absolute. Religions that had placed humanity at the center of creation were thrown into existential crisis. How could we be a chosen people if we were merely one data point among countless others? Some faiths collapsed, unable to reconcile their doctrines with the stark, cold reality of the Atlas data. Others adapted, reinterpreting their gods, not as creators of humanity, but as creators of the universe in which these silent watchers resided, recasting our story as a small part of a much grander divine cosmic play. Atheism, too, found itself on uncertain ground. The absence of a deity was one thing, but the undeniable presence of a godlike technological intelligence was another entirely. It was a secular apocalypse, a moment where our belief in our own intellectual supremacy was irrevocably broken. A new school of thought emerged, transcendent naturalism, which held that the universe naturally gives rise to such intelligences and that our purpose was not divinely ordained, but was perhaps to one day understand and join them. Our art, our music, our literature, it all began to shift. The themes of human struggle and triumph suddenly seemed so small, so provincial. A new genre of art emerged, one obsessed with deep time, with alien perspectives, with the crushing scale of the cosmos. Sculptures were built that would only align with constellations a million years in the future. Music was composed using the mathematical ratios found in the Atlas signal, creating soundscapes that were hauntingly beautiful and profoundly inhuman. We began to see ourselves through the probe's eyes, a fleeting, chaotic, beautiful, and perhaps ultimately insignificant flicker of light in an ancient, crowded darkness. Our very definition of we began to expand. The old divisions of nation, race, and creed which had driven so much of our history suddenly felt absurd. Faced with the quiet immensity of the Watchers, we were no longer Americans or Chinese or Nigerians. We were simply Earthlings. A new planetary consciousness began to form, not out of idealism, but out of a shared, humbling and terrifying sense of perspective. We were one tribe living on one fragile island, finally aware of the vast, deep ocean that surrounded us. But this new unity was not without its shadows. Fear is a powerful primal force. and the knowledge that we had been observed by an inscrutable intelligence sparked new and terrifying anxieties. Paranoia became a global pandemic. Was this a precursor to an invasion, a final observation before our experiment was terminated? Doomsday cults emerged, worshipping the Watchers and preaching that the Atlas probe was a harbinger of humanity's end or its forced ascension. Governments, while publicly calling for calm and unity, secretly poured trillions into new planetary defense initiatives, designing weapons for a foe whose capabilities we couldn't even begin to imagine. A deep-seated unease settled over the human race. We looked at our neighbors, our friends, our families, and saw them differently. We were all living in a state of suspended revelation, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the Watchers to finally step out from behind the curtain. The knowledge that we were not alone was simultaneously the most unifying and the most isolating discovery in human history. We were united in our smallness, yet utterly alone with our newfound cosmic dread. And so we are left here in the echo of that final broadcast, wrestling with the legacy of a visitor who changed everything by doing almost nothing. The noise that SETI so hastily dismissed has become the single most important artifact in our possession. It is our cosmic Rosetta Stone, and we have only just begun to decipher its most basic grammar. It is the ultimate puzzle, and solving it has become the driving obsession of our species. The scientific and technological advancements spurred by our attempts to understand the probe's data have been exponential. We are reverse engineering physics from the message, developing new forms of energy, new materials, new methods of computation. It is an intellectual inheritance that will shape our civilization for millennia. We are learning, we are growing, we are becoming something new, all under the silent gaze of the beings who sent it. We have been fundamentally and permanently transfigured. There was the world before Atlas, and there is the world that comes after. There is no going back. The curtain has been pulled back not just on the universe but on ourselves. The signal did not provide answers. It did the opposite. It transformed every answer we thought we had into a profound and boundless question. It has irrevocably altered our past by revealing it was never truly ours alone. It has completely redefined our present, forcing us into a new, uncertain planetary adolescence. And it has placed a giant, unreadable signpost in front of our future, pointing the way towards a destiny we cannot yet fathom. We are left to wonder, to gaze up at the silent stars with entirely new eyes, and to ask the questions that will now define humanity for the rest of its existence. Who are they? Why, after billions of years of silence, did they choose to reveal their presence to us now? Was this message a gift of knowledge intended to help us survive our own infancy? Was it a warning? A cautionary tale buried in the data about a danger we have yet to face? Or was it something far colder, an appraisal, a final dispassionate cataloguing of our world's resources and potential sent back to an unseen client we don't know? We may not know for 1,000 years. But we know that we are on a new path. The journey is no longer about whether we can reach the stars. It is about what we will find when we get there, and what in turn has already found us here. The age of solitude is over. The age of cosmic consequence has just begun. We stand on the shore of an unimaginable ocean, holding a single enigmatic shell, listening to the roar of a universe far stranger and far more magnificent than we ever had the courage to imagine. And we are waiting